Number 1. Dalia Dippolito. A woman stands in a parking lot on a bright Florida morning, sobbing so hard her knees buckle. Police cars surround her townhome. Yellow tape stretches across the driveway. An officer walks toward her with the kind of face that only delivers one kind of news. She has just been told her husband was murdered in his sleep. What she does not know is that the cameras are already rolling, and that every tear on her face is about to be used as evidence against her. In August of 2009, in Boynton Beach, Florida, a 26-year-old newlywed named Dalia Dippolito appeared to be living the kind of life featured in glossy real estate brochures. She had married Michael Dippolito only 6 months earlier, in February of that year, after a whirlwind courtship. Michael was 38 years old, a man rebuilding his life after a prior conviction, newly out on probation and trying to start fresh. According to later court testimony, the two had actually met when Michael hired Dalia for a paid companionship arrangement, and what began as a transactional encounter turned, at least on the surface, into a fast-moving romance. He was still legally married to another woman when the two met, and within days of finalizing his divorce, he and Dalia were husband and wife. On the surface, the marriage looked like the beginning of a fresh chapter for both of them. Dalia, by most public accounts, seemed devoted, attentive, affectionate, the picture of a young wife settling into domestic life in a modest townhome the couple shared in Boynton Beach. But behind the smiles, according to prosecutors, something else was unfolding almost from the very start. Court records and investigative reporting would later reveal that Dalia had grown increasingly focused on what Michael's death might mean for her financially. Control of the townhome, his savings, a clean break from a marriage that, according to prosecutors, she had already grown to resent barely months after the wedding. Rather than filing for divorce, prosecutors allege, she began looking for someone to make the problem disappear permanently. Investigators would later present evidence suggesting Dalia had also been sending provocative messages to an ex-boyfriend, Mike Stanley, in an apparent effort to get her husband, who was still on probation, sent back to prison. One early, less lethal attempt at removing him from her life before the murder-for-hire plot took shape. By late July of 2009, prosecutors say, Michael had agreed to transfer the title of the townhome into Dalia's name, believing it would help protect his assets in case his probation status ever became complicated. Unbeknownst to him, this transfer would later be presented by prosecutors as a critical piece of the financial motive behind what came next. Dalia approached a former boyfriend, a man named Mohammed Shahada, and asked him to help her find someone willing to carry out a killing. Shahada did not comply. Instead, alarmed by what he was hearing, he went to the Boynton Beach Police Department. Officers were skeptical at first. These kinds of tips do not always pan out, and detectives have to weigh the risk of moving too quickly on unverified information against the risk of ignoring a genuine threat to someone's life. But they decided the potential danger was too great to ignore, and they opened an investigation, setting up a hidden camera inside Shahada's car and instructing him to arrange a meeting with Dalia so they could gauge how serious her intentions actually were. At the same time, by pure coincidence, the reality television show Cops happened to be filming a ride-along segment with the Boynton Beach Police Department that very week. When detectives realized they had a live solicitation to murder case developing in real time, they made an unusual decision. They would let the cameras keep rolling, folding a genuine criminal investigation into a level of documentation almost no undercover sting in American law enforcement history has ever received. Officer Whitey Jean was selected to go undercover, posing as a hired killer willing to take the job. On the 25th of July in 2009, hidden cameras captured a conversation between Dalia and the undercover officer in a pharmacy parking lot that would later become one of the most viewed pieces of undercover police footage ever released to the public. Over more than 20 minutes, Dalia can be heard discussing her husband's morning dog walking routine, the location of tender points on his body from a recent back surgery, and the layout of the home security system, details investigators say were meant to make the staged burglary-turned-murder look convincing. The undercover officer told her he planned to break into the house and shoot her husband twice in the head, framing it to look like a robbery gone wrong. At one point, the undercover officer warned her plainly, once this was set in motion, there would be no turning back, she would not have the opportunity to change her mind. Her response, according to court testimony and the released recordings, was chilling in its casualness. She told him she was certain, like 5,000% sure. Prosecutors say she agreed to pay $7,000 for the killing. 1 week later, on the 5th of August, police put their plan into motion. Dalia left for the gym that morning, unaware that this was the day. While she was working out, she received a phone call from Boynton Beach Police Sergeant Frank Ranzi, urging her to come home immediately. When she arrived, she found her quiet residential street transformed into a full-scale crime scene. Police cruisers with lights flashing, officers moving in and out of the town home, yellow tape stretched across the yard. She was told that someone had broken in and that her husband had been killed as he slept. What followed was captured on camera in full. Dalia collapsed to the pavement in visible distress, sobbing, appearing to struggle to breathe. To any bystander, it looked like the rawest moment of grief imaginable. But police already knew what she did not. Michael Dippolito was alive, safe, and being kept away from the scene specifically so this moment could play out. Within minutes, officers walked Dalia into the back of a patrol car and brought her in for questioning. There, detectives revealed the truth. The hitman was one of their own, and every conversation she believed was private had been recorded from the very beginning. During that interrogation, Dalia continued to deny wrongdoing and, according to court testimony, suggested to detectives that her husband might have staged the entire threat himself to get her in trouble. The case, and the astonishing footage that came with it, would air the following year as a special episode of Cops titled Smooth Criminal, turning what began as a routine tip into a case studded by criminal justice programs and true crime audiences alike. A controversy briefly surfaced during the legal proceedings when Dalia's attorney argued that producers from Cops had her sign a waiver without fully explaining its purpose. Testimony from a Boynton Beach police sergeant during her trial confirmed that she had been misled about what exactly the waiver was for. The revelation drew some public debate about the ethics of blending active police investigations with entertainment television, but it ultimately had little bearing on the jury's assessment of the underlying evidence. Dalia's defense would later argue something almost as strange as the crime itself, that the entire episode had been staged by her, Michael, and a friend as an attempt to manufacture viral fame, with the two of them supposedly planning to post the hitman footage to the internet themselves in hopes of landing a spot on reality television. Michael, for his part, dismissed the claim outright in later interviews, calling it, in his words, the dumbest thing he had ever heard. A jury did not find that explanation convincing. In her first trial, held in 2011, Dalia was convicted of solicitation to commit first-degree murder. At sentencing, Palm Beach County Judge Jeffrey Colbert did not mince words, calling her pure evil before sentencing her to 20 years in prison. She was later released on a $500,000 bond pending an appeal. That verdict was eventually overturned by an appellate court, which found procedural issues significant enough to warrant a new trial. A second trial in 2016 ended in a mistrial after the jury reported they were hopelessly deadlocked following 9 hours of deliberation over 2 days. In her third trial, prosecutors again relied heavily on the pharmacy parking lot recording, walking jurors through Dalia's own words describing her husband's daily habits and vulnerabilities. She was convicted a third time, and this time was sentenced to 16 years in prison. She unsuccessfully appealed that sentence to the Florida Supreme Court, which declined to hear her case without further comment. As of recent reporting, her scheduled release date sits in the early 2030s. What makes this case endure in the public imagination is not simply the plot itself, but the sheer scale of the documentation. Very few murder-for-hire cases in American history exist on film in such vivid, unbroken detail, from the initial solicitation, to the staged death notification, to the sobbing collapse on camera, to the interrogation room reveal. Clips from the case have circulated online for well over a decade, generating hours of derivative commentary, court footage compilations, and true crime programming, including a dedicated episode of Oxygen's Murder for Hire series. It stands as one of the most thoroughly recorded failed murder plots ever captured by law enforcement, a case where the manufactured performance of grief and the manufactured performance of an undercover sting collided directly on camera, and where the camera, in the end, told the truth neither performance could hide. If this case reminded you how far people are willing to go, and how far the truth always seems to catch up with them, hit that like button, drop a comment with your thoughts below, and make sure you're subscribed to Midnight Cold Case so you don't miss what's coming next. Number 2. Julia Merfeld. A young woman sits inside a parked car, laughing. She is not talking about weekend plans or a new job. She is negotiating the price of her husband's murder, and casually asking whether it can happen outside, so the house doesn't get messy. In April of 2013, in Muskegon, Michigan, 21-year-old Julia Merfeld was a young mother of 2 children, married to 27-year-old Jacob Merfeld, a member of the United States Coast Guard. Originally from Keyport, New Jersey, Julia had settled into life in Muskegon with her husband, raising their 2 young children while Jacob served. On paper, by her own later admission in court, the marriage was not defined by conflict or cruelty. There was no dramatic betrayal reported publicly, no violent argument that set events in motion. Instead, Julia would later tell investigators something almost banal in its coldness. Ending the marriage through divorce felt harder, emotionally, than simply making her husband disappear. She reasoned, according to statements captured on video and later played in court, that a divorce would mean facing judgment from her family. It would mean having a difficult conversation with Jacob about the state of their relationship. It would mean, in her words, breaking his heart. Removing him from her life permanently, she seemed to believe, would spare her all of that discomfort while also giving her access to his life insurance policy, reported at $400,000, of which she intended to use $50,000 to pay for the job. In her own words during the recorded meetings, she described the plan almost as a form of convenience, a clean getaway that would let her avoid confrontation altogether, allow a friend she wanted living with her to move in without complication, and spare her the discomfort of being judged by people close to her. She first approached a co-worker, a man named Carlos Ramos, hoping he might know someone willing to carry out the killing. Ramos, disturbed by the request, did exactly what Mohammed Shahada had done in Florida 4 years earlier. He went straight to the police. Law enforcement in Muskegon County arranged for an undercover officer to pose as a hitman and meet with Julia to determine how serious her intentions really were. What they captured over 2 separate meetings, filmed on the 9th and 10th of April in 2013, would later shock even seasoned investigators with its casual tone. In the recordings, later released publicly by the Muskegon County Prosecutor's Office, Julia is heard scheduling potential dates on her phone calendar with the same tone someone might use to book a hair appointment. During the first meeting, the undercover officer opened by telling her, "I guess we have a little business to discuss," a line that set the tone for a conversation that unfolded with an unsettling normalcy for the subject matter. She explains, in detail, the layout of her home so the killing could be staged to look like an interrupted burglary, telling the officer she wanted it to appear as non-suspicious as possible. She specifies that she wants her husband killed outside the house rather than inside, explaining that a friend was planning to move in with her afterward and she didn't want that friend to feel unsettled by a crime scene indoors, or scared to live there because of what had happened. At another point, she laughs while saying it would be messy in the house. When the undercover officer asked how she wanted it done, she suggested it should look painless if possible. "Unless you can, break his neck," she said, before ultimately agreeing that a shooting would be acceptable, telling him at one point to surprise her with the method. She promised payment of $50,000, drawn from the larger life insurance payout she expected to receive. The officer told her plainly that once she left the vehicle, there would be no walking the plan back, and that payment could come a few weeks after the killing itself, the same kind of warning Dalia Dippolito had received in Florida years earlier, and the same kind of warning that, once again, did nothing to change the outcome. Julia was arrested shortly afterward. She pleaded guilty to solicitation to commit murder. Video of the case, once released by the Muskegon County Prosecutor's Office to the local news outlet MLive, spread rapidly online and across national television, drawn to what reporters and viewers alike described as the strikingly matter-of-fact tone throughout both recorded encounters. At her sentencing hearing in July of 2013, her husband Jacob, the very man she had tried to have killed, stood up in court and asked the judge for leniency on her behalf, describing her as a godly woman who had earned his forgiveness and who he believed had grown since the crime. Julia herself told the court she did not believe she was above punishment, saying, "Fortunately, the 2 people who need to forgive me have forgiven me. My husband, who is sitting behind me, and God has also forgiven me," and that her tears reflected genuine remorse. Not everyone in her orbit was as forgiving. Her brother, Nick Antonaccio, spoke to reporters after watching the footage, saying it was hard knowing his own sister had done something like this, adding that she had laughed about it on camera and that it simply wasn't right. The presiding judge, Chief Muskegon County Circuit Judge William C. Marietti, made clear at sentencing that he did not intend to extend the same leniency her husband was asking for. He was ultimately unmoved by Jacob's plea, sentencing Julia to a term of 5 years and 8 months up to 20 years in prison. What continues to unsettle people about this case is not the plot's complexity. There was none. It was its plainness. No elaborate cover story, no financial mastermind scheme, just a young woman who found the emotional labor of divorce so unbearable that she chose, and calmly discussed, the ending of a human life instead. The video recordings, all these years later, remain some of the most widely viewed and dissected undercover murder solicitation footage in the country, specifically because of how ordinary, how disturbingly unremarkable, her tone sounds throughout, a stark contrast to the more theatrical, high-drama plots that dominate this kind of true crime coverage. If you're following along with these cases, make sure to like this video, Tell us in the comments which case has surprised you the most so far, and subscribe to Midnight Cold Case to catch every case in this series as we release them. Number 3. Pamela Smart. A 22-year-old media coordinator walks into a New Hampshire courtroom composed, polished, and unshaken. She will spend the entire trial denying any involvement in her husband's death. But months earlier, a 16-year-old girl agreed to strap a hidden microphone to her body and walk directly into a private conversation that would end up being played, word for word, in front of a jury, and in front of the entire country. On the 1st of May in 1990, in Derry, New Hampshire, 24-year-old Gregory Greg Smart, an insurance salesman, was found on the floor of his condominium with a fatal gunshot wound to the head. His wife, 22-year-old Pamela Smart, called the incident in, appearing devastated. Investigators initially treated it as what it looked like on the surface, a burglary gone catastrophically wrong. Derry police and detectives from the state's major crime unit began working the case as a botched break-in, canvassing the neighborhood and searching for signs of forced entry or missing valuables. Pamela worked as a media services coordinator at Winnicott High School in Hampton, New Hampshire, where part of her role involved overseeing a self-esteem and drug awareness program for students called Project Self-Esteem. It was through this program that she met 15-year-old William "Billy" Flynn, a sophomore at the school, in the fall of 1989. According to trial testimony, the two grew close, and by early February of 1990, Pamela had confided in Flynn that she was attracted to him. That March, according to later reporting, Pamela invited Flynn and another student, 16-year-old Cecilia Pierce, to her Derry condominium while her husband was out of town. The evening reportedly included watching a film together before Pamela and Flynn's relationship became physical. Investigators would later argue Pamela used this relationship, and the promise of a future together, to manipulate Flynn into believing that removing her husband from the picture was the only way for the two of them to build a life together, reportedly promising him and his friends a share of the life insurance payout and the ongoing relationship as incentive. Flynn was not alone in what followed. Along with 16-year-old Patrick Pete Randall and two other teenage friends, Vance Laptime and Raymond Fowler, who served as lookouts and a getaway driver, the group carried out the killing at the Smart residence while Pamela was elsewhere, seemingly establishing an alibi. According to later reporting, Flynn and Randall entered the condo together, forced Greg to his knees in the foyer, and Flynn shot him in the head while Laptime and Fowler waited outside in the getaway vehicle. For months, the case appeared to be going nowhere publicly, even as investigators quietly built their case. Police eventually received an anonymous tip suggesting 4 teenage boys had been seen near the condo on the night of the killing, one of whom was rumored to be involved in a relationship with Pamela Smart. When questioned, the boys began to cooperate, laying out the plot and Pamela's alleged role in orchestrating it. The break in cementing the case against Pamela herself came through Cecilia Pierce, the 16-year-old student intern who worked closely with Pamela at the high school and who, according to later reporting, had been aware of the plan before it happened, having reportedly even searched for a weapon on the group's behalf beforehand. When police approached her, she initially denied knowing anything, but after the boys were arrested, she came forward and agreed to cooperate. In exchange for immunity from prosecution, Pierce recorded 2 phone conversations with Pamela on the 19th of June and then wore a concealed body wire during 2 in-person meetings on the 12th and 13th of July in 1990, at Pamela's office in Hampton. What the recordings captured became, according to jurors who later spoke to the press, the single most damning piece of evidence in the entire trial. On tape, Pamela can be heard expressing frustration that the teenage boys had not cleaned up the crime scene properly, coaching Pierce on how to handle police questioning, asking who authorities were more likely to believe, a working professional or a group of teenage boys, and expressing anxiety about detection. All details that painted a picture entirely at odds with the grieving young widow the public had seen on television during the months after the killing. Word of the case spread with extraordinary speed, in large part because it involved elements rarely seen together in a single American trial: a teacher and student relationship, teenage co-conspirators, and a media-savvy defendant who had, ironically, spent her career working in television and media production before becoming the subject of one of the most heavily broadcast trials in American history. It became one of the first trials in the country to receive true wall-to-wall national television coverage, airing gavel to gavel and drawing enormous audiences. The jury was ultimately sequestered overnight during deliberations due to the sheer intensity of the media presence surrounding the courthouse. All 4 teenagers were tried separately from Pamela and pleaded guilty to lesser charges in connection with the killing, later testifying against her in exchange for reduced sentences. Each has since been released from prison. Pamela Smart went to trial in March of 1991 and was convicted on all charges connected to her husband's death, including accomplice to first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and witness tampering. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence she continues to serve today, having spent decades filing unsuccessful appeals and public campaigns for clemency. Her latest petition for a sentence reduction was dismissed by New Hampshire's highest court in March of 2023. In June of 2024, in a videotaped statement, she accepted responsibility for her husband's death for the first time publicly. While in prison, she has reportedly earned 2 master's degrees and was ordained as a minister. Cecilia Pierce, who later went by her married name, Cecilia Blake, spent decades declining to speak publicly about the case despite the pivotal role she played in it. When she eventually did grant an interview, she said she wished she had never met Pamela Smart, and that she believed Smart needed to be fully honest about what happened before ever being considered for release. Because this case involves the exploitation and manipulation of a minor by an adult in a position of trust, we want to note that if this topic affects you personally, support and resources for young people navigating unsafe relationships with adults are available, and we always encourage reaching out to a trusted counselor, teacher, or local support organization if you or someone you know needs help. If this case left you thinking about how manipulation and control can hide behind a composed public image, let us know in the comments, tap that like button, and subscribe to Midnight Cold Case for the rest of this list. Number 4. Robert Fratta. Nearly 3 decades pass between a shooting in a suburban garage and the moment a man is finally strapped to a gurney for what the state calls justice. In between, there are pager logs, a jailhouse informant, 2 trials, 1 overturned conviction, and a man who never once, in all those years, admitted he did it. In November of 1994, in the Houston suburb of Atascocita, Texas, 33-year-old Farrah Fratta was shot twice in the head inside the garage of her own home. She was in the middle of a bitter divorce and custody battle over the couple's 3 children with her husband, Robert Fratta, a former public safety officer for the city of Missouri City who had built a career, ironically, around public protection before the marriage began to collapse. Investigators would eventually piece together a chain of command behind the killing that involved 3 men. Prosecutors alleged that Robert Fratta, unwilling to lose custody of his children or split his assets in divorce proceedings, arranged for a middleman named Joseph Priestash to find someone willing to carry out the killing. Priestash, in turn, brought in a young man named Howard Guidry to act as the shooter. For months, the case sat cold on the surface. Robert Fratta maintained an alibi built around attending a church group meeting at the time of the killing, and initially, the investigation struggled to connect him directly to the crime despite detectives' strong suspicion, given the timing of the murder in the middle of an acrimonious divorce, that he was involved. The break came not from a confession, but from an unrelated arrest. When Howard Guidry was taken into custody months later on a separate matter, his neighbor, a woman named Mary Jipp, came forward to police. Jipp was the girlfriend of Joseph Priestash, and she told investigators that her boyfriend, Guidry, and Robert Fratta had all been involved in the killing of Farrah Fratta. According to her account, Robert Fratta had offered payment, reportedly $1,000 and a Jeep, in exchange for the killing. From there, the case unraveled with more traditional evidence, pager logs and phone records connecting the 3 men in the days surrounding the murder, evidence prosecutors argued made the conspiracy nearly impossible to deny once investigators knew where to look. Priestash and Guidry both eventually confessed to their roles and, in doing so, implicated Robert Fratta directly as the man who had set the plan in motion in the first place. Both men were convicted and sentenced to death for their roles as the middleman and triggerman and, as of recent reporting, both remain on death row. Robert Fratta was convicted as the mastermind who arranged the entire plot. Robert Fratta's legal journey, however, was anything but straightforward. He was first sentenced to death in 1996, only for a federal judge to overturn that conviction on the grounds that confessions from his co-conspirators should never have been admitted as evidence against him directly at trial, since neither man had testified in person subject to cross-examination. He was retried, convicted a second time, and sentenced to death again in 2009. For the remainder of his life, Robert Fratta insisted he was innocent, arguing in later appeals that a key eyewitness had been improperly hypnotized by investigators in a way that altered her recollection of events at the scene. Her original account, his attorneys argued, described 2 men and a getaway driver, a detail that would have complicated the state's narrative that only 2 men were involved overall. None of his appeals succeeded, including a final attempt that reached the United States Supreme Court, which declined to intervene and stop the scheduled execution. As his execution date approached in January of 2023, Robert Fratta gave an interview from death row in which he described the years of waiting as, in his words, ridiculously tormenting, saying he felt he was as ready as he could be to face what was coming after 27 years of what he called torment. On the 10th of January in 2023, nearly 29 years after Fratta's death, Robert Fratta was executed by lethal injection at the state penitentiary in Huntsville, Texas, becoming the first person executed in the state that year. The execution was delayed by more than an hour after a Travis County judge attempted to halt it over concerns regarding the state's use of expired lethal injection drugs, before the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals vacated that injunction and allowed the execution to proceed. Fratta was pronounced dead at 7:49 in the evening, roughly 24 minutes after the lethal dose began. His spiritual advisor prayed over him for several minutes before the process began. Offered a chance to give a final statement, Robert Fratta simply replied, "No." He offered no final statement, despite one of his adult children and Farah's brother being present to witness the execution. Andy Kahan, a longtime victims advocate with Crime Stoppers of Houston who had made a promise to Farah's late father, Lex Bakker, to attend the execution, told reporters afterward that Fratta remained, in his words, a coward to the very end, declining even a final opportunity to speak to the son who had come to witness his death, or to offer any word of remorse. The Fratta's 3 children were raised by Farah's parents following her death. Lex Bakker, who helped raise all 3 children alongside his wife, died in 2018, 5 years before finally seeing his daughter's killer executed. The case remains one of the longest-running murder-for-hire prosecutions in Texas history, spanning nearly 30 years from the killing to the final execution, and standing as a stark example of how a conspiracy built on the assumption of a solid alibi can still collapse under the weight of the people involved in carrying it out, undone not by careful detective work in the immediate aftermath, but by the almost accidental unraveling that came when one of the hired men happened to get arrested. For something else entirely. If this case's decades-long journey through the justice system struck you, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Midnight Cold Case before we move on to number 5. Number 5. Leon Jacob and Valerie McDaniel. 2 people wake up before dawn to a knock at the door. A police sergeant stands outside with grim news. The people they wanted removed from their lives are gone. Relief, or something like it, seems to wash over them. What they don't know is that the murders they believe just happened were staged, down to the last graphic photograph, specifically to catch them in the act of paying for it. In Houston, Texas, in the mid-2010s, a relationship formed between 2 people from very different professional worlds who found common ground in shared bitterness toward their former partners. Valerie McDaniel was a well-regarded Houston veterinarian who owned her own clinic and lived in a luxury high-rise condominium in the affluent River Oaks neighborhood. She had recently gone through a difficult divorce from her husband and former business partner, Marion McDaniel III, with the 2 locked in an ongoing custody dispute over their 9-year-old daughter following a 17-year marriage. Friends and colleagues described her as miserable in that marriage, saying her husband was rarely around and that she had been deeply hurt by the relationship. Leon Philip Jacob was a surgeon whose career and personal life had both been unraveling. He had filed for bankruptcy in 2016 and was navigating a volatile breakup with his ex-girlfriend, Megan Vericas, whom he had met at a hotel in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, before the 2 relocated together to Houston as he attempted to jumpstart his medical career. That relationship had ended in January of 2017 after Vericas filed assault charges against him, accusing him of grabbing her face with his hands and applying enough pressure to bust her upper lip during an argument. Following the breakup, Jacob reportedly flooded her phone with calls and text messages, leading to his arrest on a stalking charge, and she was later granted a protective order against him. When Jacob and McDaniel began dating, the 2 met at the Willowick Condominiums, a luxury high-rise in one of Houston's wealthier corridors. Prosecutors say the 2 found what they believed was a mutually beneficial solution to both of their problems, eliminating both of their former partners so that neither would have to deal with custody battles, protective orders, or lingering conflict again. According to court testimony, they approached men they believed were hitmen and offered them $20,000 in cash along with luxury watches to carry out both killings. The men they approached were not hitmen at all. One was Motaz Azeh, a decorated United States Army veteran who had been recruited by the Houston Police Department for the operation, and the other was an undercover detective identified in court only as Detective Javier. Rather than simply arresting the pair after the initial solicitation, Houston police made the decision to see the operation through to its most convincing possible conclusion, in order to build an airtight case before either real victim was placed in any actual danger. On the 9th of March in 2017, the real McDaniel and Megan Vericas agreed to participate in an elaborate staged operation, cooperating with police to help fabricate their own deaths through graphic, realistic photographs. Detective Javier visited Jacob and McDaniel's home that day to inform them, in person, that he had good news he wanted to deliver face to face. Good news, from their perspective, being confirmation that Mac was dead. According to later television interviews with the detective, neither Jacob nor McDaniel wanted to see the photo that appeared to show Mac with a gunshot wound to the head, and neither displayed the kind of shock or horror one might expect upon hearing that a co-parent had reportedly just been killed. When asked in a later interview whether McDaniel showed any emotional reaction, or expressed any regret about how far things had gone, Detective Javier said flatly that she did not. Believing Mac was already dead, Jacob turned his attention back to arranging the second killing, discussing with the undercover detective a plan to snatch Vericas and bring her somewhere to be dealt with. Later that same night, staged photographs depicting Megan Vericas as though she had been bound, gagged, and killed were sent to Jacob's phone as well, with the detective telling him over the phone that she was dead and gone. Jacob's reported response was that he did not want to know any further details. Early on the morning of the 10th of March in 2017, at around 2 or 3 in the morning, police arrived at the couple's home to make their arrests. Sergeant Frank Quinn of the Houston Police Department later recounted that Valerie McDaniel opened the door and let officers inside, feigning surprise at their presence, what a prosecutor later in court proceedings described as an almost Oscar-worthy performance. Both Leon Jacob and Valerie McDaniel were charged with 2 counts of solicitation of capital murder. The case took a tragic turn before it could reach trial. Out on bond and awaiting a court hearing, Valerie McDaniel recorded a series of final audio messages on her iPad, reflecting on her love for her daughter and for Jacob, saying in one recording made in late March of 2017 that she had 2 great loves in her life, her daughter and Leon, and that she had never wanted to hurt anyone. 2 days before her scheduled court appearance, she died by suicide, jumping from the 7th floor balcony of her condominium. Because she died before her case could be resolved in court, Valerie McDaniel was never convicted of any crime, and under the presumption of innocence that guides the American legal system, her role in the case remains, legally speaking, an accusation rather than a proven fact. Leon Jacob stood trial alone in March of 2018. His defense argued he believed he had hired a private investigator to help him communicate with Vericas, not a hitman to kill her, an argument the jury did not find persuasive, particularly given the recorded conversations and the staged photographs presented at trial. After deliberating for less than 2 hours, jurors found him guilty on both counts of solicitation of capital murder. Juror Thelma Ginsburg later told reporters it was difficult to see him as anything but guilty, given the sheer volume of evidence, including recorded conversations played for the jury throughout the trial. He was sentenced to life in prison and ordered to pay a $10,000 fine. At his sentencing, Megan Vericas addressed him directly in the courtroom, telling him he would never get to see his own children grow up, and that they would be better off without him in their lives. Jacob had requested permission to attend McDaniel's funeral following her suicide. The request was denied by a judge. He later told reporters he did not feel responsible for her death, saying it had been a decision she made on her own. Harris County Assistant District Attorney Samantha Knecht said afterward that prosecutors were pleased with the swift verdict, adding that justice had been served in ensuring he could no longer pose a danger to the community. This case remains one of the most elaborate undercover sting operations ever documented in an American murder-for-hire prosecution, largely because of how far investigators were willing to go, recruiting real intended victims to help stage their own deaths, complete with graphic photographs designed to be entirely convincing, in order to secure irrefutable evidence before any actual harm could occur. If the staged sting in this case caught you off guard, let us know down in the comments, give this video a like, and subscribe to Midnight Cold Case so you're ready for number 6. Number 6. Susan Kuhnhausen. A tired nurse walks into her own bedroom after a long shift at the hospital, expecting nothing more than sleep. Instead, a stranger lunges at her out of the shadows, swinging a hammer at her head. What he doesn't know is that he picked the wrong house, and the wrong woman. On the 6th of September in 2006, in Portland, Oregon, 51-year-old Susan Kuhnhausen finished a shift as an emergency room nurse at Providence Portland Medical Center, a job she had held for roughly 3 decades. She stopped by a hair salon on her way home, picking up a magazine while she waited and joking with her stylist about needing a new color to get through a difficult divorce, before arriving at her 1-story Cape Cod home in the Montevilla neighborhood a little after 6:30 in the evening. Susan and her husband of nearly 18 years, Michael Mike Kuhnhausen, had been separated for about a year but were, by Susan's own account, still on cordial terms, and Mike still had access to the home. When Susan walked in, she found a note from him near the microwave, saying he hadn't been sleeping well and had gone to the beach to clear his head. She thought nothing of it and continued into her bedroom, The house had seemed eerily dark to her when she arrived, though she initially chalked it up to having simply forgotten to open the curtains that morning, where a man was waiting for her in the shadows, armed with a red and black claw hammer. The intruder rushed at her, swinging the hammer wildly, striking her in the head several times. But Susan managed to wrestle the hammer away from him during the struggle, losing her grip on it briefly before the fight continued hand to hand. What followed was a violent, prolonged physical fight. The man bit her, and she bit back, before Susan, drawing on her physical strength and the same steady composure that decades in an emergency room had built in her, managed to get on top of her attacker and place him in a chokehold. She held on until he stopped moving. Then she made her way to a neighbor's house and asked them to call for help. "We have an intruder in the house next door," the neighbor told the 911 dispatcher. The intruder was in the bedroom with a hammer. The woman who lives there thinks she may have strangled him. He was down when she left. When police arrived, they found the intruder, later identified as 59-year-old Edward Dalton Haffey, dead at the scene from strangulation. At first, investigators treated it as what it appeared to be, a burglary interrupted by a homeowner who successfully defended herself. But a search of Haffey's belongings told a very different story. Inside his backpack, detectives found a day planner with the words "Call Mike, Get Letter" written under a date earlier that week, along with a folder bearing Michael Kuhnhausen's cell phone number. A background check on Haffey revealed a long criminal history, including prior convictions for burglary, robbery, and a previous conspiracy to commit aggravated murder charge. Investigators also discovered that Michael Kuhnhausen had once worked as a manager at an adult video store where Haffey had been employed as a custodian, the connection that first linked the two men together. Susan told detectives that she suspected her estranged husband might be involved, explaining that he was the only other person who knew the security code to her home's alarm system, and that there had been no signs of forced entry. She also mentioned that he had stopped by earlier that day, evidenced by the note he'd left. Her instincts were confirmed. Investigators determined that Michael Kuhnhausen had helped disarm the security alarm at the house and paid Haffey approximately $50,000 to break in and kill Susan, letting him inside undetected ahead of her arrival home from work. Michael Kuhnhausen was arrested days later and charged with criminal conspiracy to commit murder and attempted murder, held on $500,000 bail. Susan Kuhnhausen's case became a national story almost overnight, less for the plot itself than for its outcome. A woman targeted for a professional killing who overpowered and defeated her own would-be assassin using nothing but her bare hands. Reporting on the case noted that as news of the attack spread, her estranged husband reportedly wrote a suicide note and purchased a gun, seemingly overwhelmed by the unraveling of his plan and its public exposure. According to the affidavit filed in the case, Susan had told officers her husband had been distraught about the divorce and had wanted to reconcile, but that she had been insistent on moving forward with it. Context prosecutors would later point to as a possible motive for the plot. Police in Portland later recognized Susan publicly for what they described as sheer determination in the face of a life-threatening attack. In the years since, Susan, who now goes by Susan Walters, has become deeply involved in victim advocacy work in the Portland area, partnering with local organizations including Women's Strength and Girl Strength, community programs focused on personal safety and empowerment, as well as the Oregon Crime Victims Law Center. In 2017, she worked with the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office to help create Case Companion, a free website designed to support crime victims navigating the justice system in the Portland area, turning what had nearly become her own murder case into the foundation for work helping other survivors find their footing afterward. Michael Kuhnhausen never faced the conclusion of a trial for his role in the plot. He later died of cancer while in custody, just months before his scheduled release, leaving many of the deeper questions about his exact motivations formally unanswered in a courtroom, even as the physical evidence against him remained overwhelming. If Susan's fight for survival left you as amazed as it left us, drop a comment telling us what stood out to you most, tap that like button, and subscribe to Midnight Cold Case before we move to number 7. Number 7. Laura Buckingham. A former Marine hands cash and a hand-drawn map to a man she believes is a professional killer. She has no idea he's an undercover agent, and no idea that the man who tipped off police in the first place is someone she trusted more than almost anyone else in her life, her own boyfriend. In Roane County, Tennessee, in the mid-2010s, 29-year-old Laura Buckingham was a former United States Marine who had previously run a bakery and bed and breakfast business in New Albany, Indiana, before closing it in 2015 and relocating out of state. She was locked in a difficult and ongoing custody dispute with Bradley Sutherland, a resident of a different state and the father of her young son, over visitation rights and travel arrangements for their then 3-year-old child. As the dispute wore on, Buckingham grew increasingly desperate, fearing she might eventually lose custody of her son entirely, and frustrated by the repeated long trips required to deliver him for visitation with Sutherland. According to court documents, she turned to her boyfriend at the time, Joseph Chamberlain, a former Marine sniper with deployment experience in Afghanistan. Chamberlain had also previously been court-martialed after video surfaced showing him urinating on the bodies of deceased Taliban fighters, and asked him whether he could help make Sutherland go away. At first, Chamberlain believed she was joking. But when she brought the subject up again, and began asking more specific questions about how such a plan might actually be carried out, he realized she was serious. Rather than involve himself, Chamberlain began secretly recording their conversations and, within weeks, brought the recordings to the Roane County Sheriff's Office. A detective who reviewed the tapes later wrote in a report that it was unmistakably clear Buckingham was not joking, and that she was actively considering how to have Sutherland killed without facing consequences herself. Investigators arranged for Buckingham to be introduced to an undercover agent with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, posing as a hitman willing to take the job. During recorded conversations in February of 2016, Buckingham agreed to pay him $30,000 for the killing and handed over an initial payment along with information to help locate Sutherland, including maps and details about his routine. To bring the operation to a convincing close and gather enough evidence for a strong prosecution, investigators coordinated with Sutherland himself, arranging for him to appear to stage his own death in a parking garage, convincing Buckingham the plan had succeeded before her arrest. Sutherland later described the entire experience as deeply traumatic, telling reporters that in all honesty, he and his family initially thought they were being punked for a short period of time before realizing how serious the situation truly was. He noted publicly that his own family had been approached about turning the strange, almost cinematic sequence of events into a book or film, going so far as to formally and publicly reserve any rights to future books, screenplays, or television adaptations related to the case, an offer he said he intended to handle carefully given how serious the ordeal had actually been for him and his family. Buckingham was indicted on a charge of first-degree attempted murder, later amended in June of 2016 to solicitation to commit first-degree murder, a Class B felony. In court proceedings that followed, she ultimately pleaded guilty to the amended charge, which under Tennessee law carried a potential sentence range of 8 to 30 years, though because she had no prior criminal history, her exposure was reduced to a range of 8 to 12 years, and prosecutors agreed to a 10-year sentence as part of her plea, finalized in December of 2018. Reporting on the case noted that Buckingham's lack of any prior criminal history and disclosed struggles with post-traumatic stress following her military service, along with the fact that she was reportedly pregnant again at the time of her legal proceedings, were factors her attorney raised in hopes of securing a more lenient outcome. What makes this case particularly striking is the role reversal at its center. A trained military sniper capable of carrying out violence with precision and experience chose instead to protect a man he barely knew from a woman he loved, walking directly into a law enforcement partnership rather than becoming a participant in a killing. His decision effectively ended the plot before it ever had a chance to unfold, turning what might have been a tragic parking lot ambush into a carefully documented sting operation instead. If Joseph Chamberlain's choice to come forward struck you as the real turning point in this story, tell us in the comments, hit like, and subscribe to Midnight Cold Case as we head into number 8. Number 8. Thomas Randolph. A 911 call comes in from a man who says a masked intruder just broke into his home and shot his wife. By the time police arrive, the intruder is dead too, shot, the caller says, in self-defense. It would take investigators years, 2 trials, and a mountain of insurance paperwork to prove that the Real story was far darker than a home invasion gone wrong. Thomas Randolph, a Nevada resident, was married 6 times over the course of his life. By the time his final case reached national television audiences, 4 of those 6 wives were dead, and questions swirled around his role in more than one of those deaths, earning him the nickname the Black Widower in press coverage and true crime programming, including a 2021 Dateline NBC miniseries titled The Widower. A producer connected to that series once described Randolph as almost impossible to look away from, comparing the strange pull of his story to some of the more bizarre true crime figures to capture national attention in recent memory. The case that ultimately led to his conviction centered on his 6th wife, Sharon Corse. On the 8th of May in 2008, Randolph called 911 and told operators that a masked intruder had broken into their home, shot Sharon, and that he had then shot and killed the intruder in what he described as an act of self-defense. When police arrived and identified the dead man, Randolph told them he recognized the intruder. It was Michael Miller, a man he knew personally as a friend and handyman. Prosecutors, however, built a very different case using phone records and financial documentation. They argued that Randolph had, in fact, hired Miller himself to stage a break-in and kill Sharon, intending to collect on life insurance policies he had taken out on her in the 2 years leading up to her death, reportedly worth more than $300,000. Once Miller had completed the job, prosecutors alleged, Randolph shot and killed him as well, eliminating the one person who could connect him directly to the plan, and simultaneously creating a cover story in which he appeared to be a grieving husband who had bravely defended his home from a violent stranger. The case against Randolph extended well beyond the events of that single night. Investigators and prosecutors examined the broader pattern of his marriages. His fourth wife, Frances Randolph, had died during heart surgery in 2004, and a witness later told jurors that Randolph had, before her death, offered to pay that same witness to kill Frances and had suggested the death be staged as a burglary, a plan that, according to testimony, never had to be carried out because Frances died on the operating table instead. His fifth wife, Leona Stapleton, died of cancer, according to testimony from her family. And his second wife, Becky Galt, had died in Utah in 1986, a case in which Randolph had previously been arrested but ultimately acquitted. Prosecutors were permitted to introduce evidence connected to the Utah case in Randolph's first trial, painting a broader pattern that jurors were asked to consider alongside the physical evidence from Sharon's killing. In 2017, a jury convicted Randolph of murder and sentenced him to death. That conviction, however, did not stand. In 2020, the Nevada Supreme Court overturned both the conviction and the death sentence, ruling that the trial court should never have allowed jurors to hear that prior bad act evidence connected to the Utah case, since Randolph had been formally acquitted of any wrongdoing in that matter, and the appellate court found its inclusion had likely swayed the jury unfairly. The ruling forced prosecutors to start over, and Randolph faced a second trial for the same charges beginning in August of 2023, using a wheelchair by that point and relying on headphones to accommodate hearing loss as jury selection got underway. At his retrial, prosecutors again laid out the financial trail connecting Randolph to Sharon's death, the life insurance policies taken out shortly before her killing, the timeline of his relationship with Miller, and phone records tracing communications between the two men in the lead-up to the crime, along with testimony from the witness who described Randolph's earlier offer to have Frances killed years before. After 5 hours of deliberation, the jury once again found Randolph guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and 2 counts of murder with the use of a deadly weapon. Randolph, reportedly employing a strategy throughout the proceedings of firing multiple attorneys and filing numerous motions in an apparent effort to delay the trial, sat largely emotionless as the second verdict was read. This time, prosecutors chose not to pursue the death penalty, and Randolph was ultimately sentenced to a minimum of 60 years in prison. Colleen Bayer, Sharon's daughter, was present for both verdicts, gasping and clasping her hands to her mouth when the second guilty verdict was announced. She told reporters afterward it had been a 15-year ordeal that she described as a twisted nightmare, expressing relief that her mother's case had finally reached a conclusion she felt reflected the truth, and that she was thrilled Randolph would no longer be able to harm another woman. What makes this case so unusual within the broader landscape of murder-for-hire schemes is the layered deception at its core, a killer who didn't simply hire someone to eliminate a spouse, but who then eliminated his own hired accomplice and constructed an entirely fictional home invasion narrative to cover both deaths at once, a plan that ultimately unraveled only through years of patient financial and forensic investigation, 2 full trials, and a pattern of behavior across multiple marriages that prosecutors argued were simply too consistent to be coincidence. If the layers of deception in this case kept you guessing, let us know in the comments below, tap like, and subscribe to Midnight Cold Case as we approach number 9. Number 9. Fredric Tokars. 2 young boys sit in the back seat of their family's car, home from a holiday trip, when a stranger forces their mother back behind the wheel at gunpoint. Minutes later, both boys are alone on the side of the road, covered in blood, walking toward a stranger's house for help. Their father would later be accused of orchestrating the entire nightmare. Fredric "Fred" Tokars was, on paper, one of Atlanta's most respected legal minds, a former prosecutor turned prominent criminal defense attorney, well known within Georgia's legal community for a career that had taken him from the courtroom side of enforcement to its side of defense. Behind that respected public image, however, investigators would later allege that Tokars had built a secretive second career, using his legal expertise and business connections to help launder money for drug trafficking operations moving cocaine into Georgia from Miami and Los Angeles, funneling it through more than 20 businesses to conceal the criminal activity, and to establish counterfeit financial schemes hidden behind a network of legitimate-seeming companies. His wife, 39-year-old Sarah Tokars, was, according to later reporting, growing increasingly aware of her husband's hidden financial dealings, and family members later said she had confided to relatives that Fred was often angry and temperamental at home in the months leading up to her death. On the 29th of November in 1992, Sarah was returning home to the couple's residence in Cobb County, Georgia, with their 2 young sons, 6-year-old Ricky and 4-year-old Mike, after a Thanksgiving holiday trip to visit family in Florida. As she entered the garage of their home, a stranger forced her back into the vehicle at gunpoint, with both boys still in the backseat, and drove a short distance down the residential street near their Kings Cove neighborhood before pulling over. There, the assailant, later identified as Curtis Rower, forced Sarah out of the vehicle, and after she screamed, shot her at close range with a shotgun in front of her 2 young sons. Rower then fled the scene on foot, leaving the boys physically unharmed but alone in the vehicle. The 2 children managed to make their way to a nearby house, where residents called for help. Fred Tokars quickly became a person of interest in the investigation. He publicly and tearfully denied any involvement at a press conference, telling reporters he emphatically denied any role in his wife's death and describing how depressed he had become, saying he found himself grieving not only his wife but the entire lifestyle he felt he was losing alongside her. Investigators, however, were building a case that told a very different story. Curtis Rower, the shooter, was eventually apprehended, along with a business associate of Fred Tokars named Eddie Lawrence, a real estate developer who served as the middleman connecting Tokars to Rower. Both men ultimately implicated Fred Tokars as the person who arranged and financed the killing, motivated, prosecutors argued, by his fear that Sarah would expose his money laundering and drug trafficking connections if their marriage ended in a contentious divorce and she went public with what she knew. The federal investigation into Tokars' broader criminal enterprise revealed an operation prosecutors described as having used force and violence, including kidnapping, torture, and murder, to protect its continuity and shield its members from arrest and prosecution. Allegations that painted Fred Tokars not simply as an isolated husband desperate to silence his wife, but as a man embedded in a much larger and more violent criminal network. The case drew intense national media attention, both for its shocking violence in front of 2 young children and for the bizarre behind-the-scenes drama that surrounded the investigation. 2 Cobb County police detectives working the case were fired after it emerged they had signed a movie deal to turn the case into a film, and a local television reporter was also let go from his station after a similar conflict of interest came to light involving a private investigator connected to Sarah's family who had partnered with a lawyer to try to sell a movie about the murder. Fred Tokars was first convicted on federal racketeering charges connected to his financial crimes in 1994 and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Several years later, in a separate trial held in 1997, relocated to Lafayette, Georgia, due to the overwhelming pretrial publicity in the Atlanta area, he was convicted of first-degree murder for orchestrating his wife's killing and received an additional life sentence. During that trial, it was revealed that Sarah Tokars had in fact known about her husband's unsavory business dealings, including the laundering of drug money, in the period leading up to her death. Fred Tokars maintained his innocence in his wife's murder for the remainder of his life, even as he served consecutive life sentences stemming from both the racketeering conviction and the murder conviction. He died in a federal prison in Pennsylvania in May of 2020 at the age of 67, following years of declining health connected to multiple sclerosis, a neurological condition that had left him unable to walk for roughly a decade, after experiencing a persistent fever in the days before his death. His sons, Ricky and Mike, were raised by Sarah's father, Lex Backer, following her death and, according to those close to the family, chose never to have any further contact with their father for the rest of his life. A family friend of the boys later said there was simply never a good reason for them to get to know Fred Tokars, given what he had done. A former assistant United States attorney who prosecuted the racketeering case, Buddy Parker, later told reporters that he had called Tokars evil in his closing argument all those years earlier, and that nothing about the years that followed, including hearing how Tokars died, still maintaining his innocence, had ever changed his mind. One of Sarah's sisters told local reporters she believed Fred Tokars should have faced the harshest possible punishment decades earlier, rather than dying of natural causes in a federal prison bed. If this case's mix of financial corruption and personal betrayal left an impression on you, let us know down in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe to Midnight Cold Case as we move into our final case. Number 10. Wendy Lynn Wein. A woman sits down at her computer and types a request into a website most people would assume is a joke, a site literally named Rent a Hitman. She has no idea the site exists specifically to catch people exactly like her, and that her request is about to land directly on a state police detective's desk. In South Rockford, Michigan, in the summer of 2020, 52-year-old Wendy Lynn Wein found herself in an escalating conflict with her ex-husband, who she believed had stolen money from her during their relationship. Rather than pursuing the matter through legal or civil channels, Wein turned to the internet, searching for a way to have him killed rather than face the possibility of legal consequences herself, later telling investigators she preferred that option to what she described as going to jail. Her search led her to a website called rentahitman.com, a site that presents itself, at first glance, as a legitimate service for hiring a contract killer, complete with a professional-looking layout and a tongue-in-cheek promise to find the ideal solution for your particular situation. In reality, the site is an elaborate parody, created and maintained by a man named Bob Innes, who built it specifically as satire, and who, over the years, discovered that a surprising number of visitors were using it in deadly earnest. Innes has said that as far back as 2008, he began checking the site's inbox and was stunned to find hundreds of emails from people around the world genuinely requesting what the site jokingly refers to as asset extraction services. According to reporting on the site's history, more than a dozen people over the years have been identified and, in many cases, arrested after using the site to seek out a real killer. Wein initially submitted her request using a false name, but ultimately completed her formal service request under her real identity, providing details about her situation and her intended target. According to Innes, he personally reached out to confirm two things: whether she still wanted to move forward, and whether she would be willing to meet with a representative in person. Wein said yes to both. As he had done with other serious inquiries submitted through his site over the years, Innes forwarded her information directly to law enforcement, in this case, the Michigan State Police. Investigators arranged for an undercover trooper to pose as a hired killer and meet with Wein at a local cafe. There, she explicitly told the undercover trooper that she wanted her ex-husband killed, and provided his home address, his place of work, and details about his daily schedule to help facilitate the plan. The two met again later that same day in a parking lot, where Wein handed over a $200 down payment, explaining that the extra funds were meant to help cover travel expenses since her ex-husband lived out of state. She promised a total payment of $5,000 once the job was completed. She was taken into custody shortly after making that payment. Michigan State Police Lieutenant Brian Alexic later told reporters he found it hard to believe someone would think a website like Rent a Hitman actually existed as advertised, while Innes, for his part, noted that this kind of misunderstanding was fairly common. People reaching out in earnest to a site he built purely as a joke, unaware that its entire purpose, at this point, had effectively become a public service in cooperation with law enforcement. Wein pleaded guilty in November of 2021 to solicitation of murder and to using a computer to commit a crime. At her sentencing hearing roughly 2 months later, in January of 2022, she told the court she was not making excuses for her actions and simply wanted the judge to understand where her mindset had been at the time, adding that she had lost 8 family members and wanted to take full responsibility for her crime regardless of what she had been going through personally. The presiding judge, Daniel White, said he had taken both the seriousness of her crime and her documented mental health struggles into account in reaching a decision, ultimately sentencing her to a term of 7 to 20 years in prison, with credit applied for the 545 days she had already spent in custody while her case moved through the court system. What makes this case such a fitting close to this list is what it reveals about how far modern murder-for-hire investigations have evolved. Wendy Lynn Wein wasn't caught by an undercover officer working a tip from a nervous friend or co-worker, and she wasn't caught in an elaborate, multi-day sting built around staged crime scenes. She was caught because the very website she turned to for help was designed, from the ground up, as a trap, proof that in the modern era, even the tools people believe will help them commit a crime in secret can just as easily be the tools that expose them completely. Across all 10 of these cases, one pattern holds true from Florida to Michigan, from New Hampshire to Nevada. No matter how confident these masterminds felt in their plans, every single one of them was undone by the same simple truth. Someone they trusted, or someone they believed they could trust, chose not to become part of the plot, and that one decision, every single time, was enough to bring the entire scheme crashing down. That wraps up all 10 cases in this list. If you made it this far, thank you for spending this time with us. That means a lot. Let us know in the comments which case you found the most unbelievable. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss a new case from Midnight Cold Case.